Good afternoon. I am Jackie Moserell, Dean of Saunders College of Business at RIT. Welcome to our 2021 Distinguished Gasser Lecture Series and Keynote Address for this year's Entrepreneurship Conference. A special thank you to our interpreters today. We are so proud of the great access services found here at RIT. The Gasser Lecture Series is hosted by Saunders College of Business as a continuing forum for our students, alumni, and friends to meet with distinguished leaders from business and educational communities. It is made possible by a gift from the late John Wiley Jones, former honorary member of the RIT Board of Trustees and founder of Jones Chemical, in memory of William D. Gasser, an accounting lecturer at RIT. For today's talk, we kindly request no audio or visual recordings. For our students out there, I hope you have been enjoying this year's conference, the 2021 Entrepreneurship Conference, and that you are considering entering our Vandenbrüel Student Entrepreneurship Award to win cash prizes to fuel your business pursuits. Please check out our website for details. At RIT and Saunders College, we benefit from a rich entrepreneurial culture, highlighted by the Simone Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship and their extensive resources in support of Tiger Tanks and accelerator programming, the Construct Makerspace for rapid prototyping, Magic Spell Studios, and so much more. This helps explain our excitement in welcoming today's keynote speaker, Suneel Gupta. Suneel is the author of the best-selling book, Backable. The book is rooted in Suneel's journey from the face of failure for the New York Times to the new face of innovation for the New York Stock Exchange. Suneel is the founding CEO of Rise, which partnered with then First Lady Michelle Obama to deliver low-cost healthcare services to people in need. Rise was named Apple's App of the Year and sold in a successful exit to One Medical. Suneel now serves on the faculty at Harvard University and as an emissary for gross national happiness between the United States and the Kingdom of Bhutan. Suneel has been asked about his purpose. His response was, to find good people and inspire them to do what inspires them. Today, Suneel will share with us thinking like an entrepreneur, what entrepreneurs can teach intrapreneurs. Please note, there will be time at the end of his talk for a few questions from the audience, and with staff on hand to pass the microphones. Also, please join us in Fireside Lounge for a book and poster signing reception with Suneel immediately following his remarks. Before we begin, though, I would like to announce the 3 winners of Suneel's book, Backable, from our Saunders College of Business social media giveaway. Congratulations, Mike Hibbard, Amanda Sindara, and Alden Smith. Please stop by the Saunders. Please stop by the Saunders table after the lecture to retrieve your prize. Now, please join me in welcoming Suneel Gupta.
So is this where I give my pitch for Tiger Tank? 13 years ago, I was sitting where you're sitting right now, which I know sounds kind of crazy because some people tell me that I look like I'm 13 years old. But it was 2008, and I was right about to finish business school, and I was so excited about what was next, what was going to happen when I got into the real world, when I got a job. But I got to be honest with you. For a few years, really the first 5 years, I really had no idea what I was doing. I really felt pretty lost. You see, I started a couple of companies, And both of them, let's just say they did not succeed. And then I joined another company that I thought was going to actually be a big hit. It was called Groupon. And I joined when the company was less than 100 people. And within 2 years, we grew to over 10,000 people. We went from less than $1 million in revenue to over $1 billion in revenue. We went from a small private startup to a big public company. And it all happened so fast. We were growing faster than Facebook, growing faster than Amazon, growing faster than Google. And then it all came crashing down. Within a couple of financial quarters, we lost 80% of our market value. 80%. And for me, that basically meant 3 failures in a row. Not a great track record, is it? Some of you are wondering right now, are we sure we got the right guy up on stage? But then a few years ago, something happened that really changed, I think, everything for me. And it was a phone call, and the phone call was from the organizer of a conference. And she says to me, hey, you have been nominated twice to speak at our conference. And I said, well, that's wonderful. What's the name of the conference? And she said, FailCon. The name of the conference is FailCon, which stands for Failure Conference. So I had been nominated twice to be the keynote speaker of a conference about failure. And I'm up on stage, and I'm giving this talk, and I don't realize this at the time, but there's a reporter from the New York Times in the audience taking notes. So fast forward to just a few weeks later, a full-length article on failure with my face as the cover of this article. And the story goes viral. Literally, I mean, it is one of the most shared stories of that quarter for the New York Times. It's everywhere. There was a point in time, believe it or not, where you could have Googled the word failure, and my face would have been one of your first search results. I remember my dad had one of those Google keyword alerts, and he's the one who forwarded me the article. Imagine, he got like a Google keyword alert saying his son was in the New York Times. He opens it up, it's detailing all of his son's failures. And a friend of mine who is much wiser than me gave me a piece of advice that really sort of changed things for me and changed the way that I look at the world, which was, hey, why don't you find a way to make some meaning out of this article? Find a way to put it to use in some way. Instead of treating it as just an embarrassment, do something with it. And so the parable that he shared with me, the little story he shared with me, it's a Buddhist parable, is that every time you feel hurt in life, every time you feel pain, there are 2 arrows that are fired. The first arrow is the arrow that actually makes you feel the pain, but the second arrow is the arrow where you ascribe some kind of meaning to that pain. Now, you don't have any control over the first arrow, but you have a lot of control over the second arrow. And for me, the way I chose to use that second arrow is I started to email all of these people that I admired, from Oscar-winning filmmakers to celebrity chefs to military leaders to leaders within iconic companies. And what I would do is I would send them a copy of this article. I'd literally send them a link, but with a cold email, and I would say, hey, as you can see from this article, I have no idea what I'm doing. Would you be willing to give me some advice? And the response rate to that email was extraordinarily high. I got to sit down with all these people that I admired. And what I found out from that experience is that the most extraordinary people in the world are not necessarily entrepreneurs, but they are all entrepreneurial. They have learned the craft of bringing their ideas into the world, and they have learned the art of getting other people to believe in their ideas. And once I started to learn this craft, once I started to practice what I was learning from these conversations, I wanted to spend time with even more people. And so for the past 8 years, I've been studying extraordinarily entrepreneurial people. And what I want to share with you tonight are 4 lessons. 4 lessons from that time. 4 things that you can put into practice immediately from some of the most entrepreneurial people in the world. So the first lesson is this: flip outsiders to insiders. Flip outsiders to insiders. So what does that mean? Well, one of the stories that I continued to come across over and over again during my research, during all these conversations, and now it's been hundreds of conversations, is the story of Betty Crocker in the 1940s. And you may have heard this story before, but in the 1940s, Betty Crocker introduced instant cake mix to the market. And they believed that instant cake mix was going to be a huge, huge hit. Because they had done all the consumer research, they knew that people were into this type of product, and so they launched it to markets everywhere, and they put a lot of marketing dollars behind it. It was a big campaign, and then they waited for the sales numbers to come in, and when the sales numbers came in, they were shocked. What they found was that nobody was buying this instant cake mix, and they couldn't figure out why. And so they hire a psychologist, a guy by the name of Ernest Dykta, to go out into the field and start interviewing customers. And what Dykta finds was really surprising. Dykta comes back to the executives at Betty Crocker and he says, listen, I think you have made the process of making a cake too easy, too simple. Because when the cake comes out of the oven, a customer actually doesn't really feel like it's their cake. So they don't have any ownership over it. And so Dykta's recommendation was, why don't you remove one key ingredient and just see what happens? And so they do. They remove the egg. So now, as a customer, you have to go out and you have to buy fresh eggs, you bring it home, you crack the eggs into the mix, you stir it up, and then you put it in the oven, and sales completely take off. Because now, when a customer pulls a cake out of the oven, they actually feel like it's their cake too. Researchers have unpacked this idea over and over again. There was a group out of Harvard that called this the Ikea Effect. And the Ikea Effect basically tells us that we place up to 5 times the amount of value on something that we help build than something that we simply buy off the shelf. And so you have a lot of people out there with poorly made futons and furniture, and then they're never going to get rid of because they built it themselves. So what does this have to do with creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship? Well, we've kind of been told that creativity is a 2-step formula, right? You come up with a great idea and then you execute on it really well. But there's a hidden step in between. And that hidden step is where we get other people to crack their egg into our mix, so that by the time we show up to execution phase, we show up together. And I believe that you can trace every successful product, every successful startup, every successful big company, every successful political movement back to this hidden step. It was never just one person who went from idea to execution. It was always a group of people who felt founder-level passion about the idea, even if they didn't come up with the idea themselves. So one of the most important things you can do as someone who is entrepreneurial is to let other people crack their egg into your mix. I know that might sound a little bit non-intuitive, but there are a couple of ways to think about this. The first is to steer into the objections of your idea. So if you're trying to hand somebody an egg and you want people in the room to get involved and get excited about your idea, oftentimes what we do is we walk in with a bulletproof, detailed plan, right? Because that's kind of what we've been taught to do, walk in with every detail figured out. But the problem with that is that when you walk into a room with every single detail figured out, you shut other people out of the creative process. So what really entrepreneurial people tend to do is they actually don't walk in with every single detail figured out. They share what it could be, but not exactly how it has to be. Let me say that again. They share what it could be, but not exactly how it has to be. And one of the ways that they do that is actually by steering into the objections of their idea. So look, how often has it been, especially with a new idea, that with any new idea, there's going to be holes, there's going to be gaps, right? And sometimes, as entrepreneurial people, we kind of walk into a room or we try to get other people excited about our idea, and we hope that they're not going to point to those weaknesses. We hope that they're not going to bring those things up. What I've noticed about smart entrepreneurs is that they'll actually bring those things up themselves. So when I spent time with Reid Hoffman, who is the founder of LinkedIn, what Reid told me is that in 2003, when he was starting LinkedIn, it was a very tricky time to start an internet business because a lot of you are too young to remember, but in 2001, the bubble burst. And so nobody was investing in internet companies after the bubble burst. And if you were investing in an internet company, it had to be a company that was making revenue. But the problem for LinkedIn is that they weren't making a dime of revenue at that time. So instead of hiding from that, when Reid Hoffman was out there fundraising for LinkedIn, he would walk into a room with investors and he would say, hey, before we even get started, I want to let you know, we're not making any revenue right now. But there are 3 ways that we believe that we can over the next 5 years. And in this presentation, I'm going to walk through those 3 ways. Now, it doesn't mean that your answers to their objections need to be bulletproof. But just the fact that you are thinking about what they might object to, when you do that and you steer directly into it, a couple of things happen. Number 1 is that you earn a lot of credibility as an entrepreneur or somebody who's entrepreneurial. Whenever you can steer into the objections of your own idea, people know that you've been thinking about it from all different angles, and that wins you a lot of credibility. But the second thing, and this is magic when this works, is that when you steer into the objections of an idea, you point out the problems, what happens? People turn into solutions. People actually want to help solve the problem. So now you've turned a group of people who might be there to poke holes in your idea, you've turned them into people who actually want to help solve problems with you. You have flipped outsiders into insiders. You've basically handed them an egg that they can crack into your mix. The second thing I'll say about sharing what it could be is not what it has to be is there was a story that I love about a designer who was incredibly entrepreneurial. And he was a designer within big companies like Microsoft and Google. And when I went and studied sort of his behaviors, I asked him, like, how did this all start? How did you become the person inside these big companies that everybody wants to work with? How did you become this person that everybody wants to give the coolest projects to? And he tells me a story. And the story is that when he used to present his designs, he'd walk into a room with pixel-perfect versions of what he wanted to create. So he'd walk into a room with executives, and he would show them big designs on a screen like this, and he'd say, hey, what do you think? And what he found is that more often than not, they would say, we don't like it. We don't like those designs. And it was very frustrating for him. So one day, he accidentally forgets his laptop, but he's got a design meeting. So he walks into the room, but he doesn't have his laptop, and he doesn't know what to do because he can't share the designs. So instead, he walks up to the whiteboard and literally just starts to draw out his design, just draws it out. And what he found is that in that meeting, people got up out of their seats, they walked over to the whiteboard with him, and they started to draw alongside him. And by the time he left that meeting, he actually had a very clear vision, but a shared vision with that group of people on what they were going to do next. He said that was the most productive meeting in his 15 years as a designer at these big companies. It's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because usually we would think that when we walk into a room, we want to walk in with pixel-perfect answers. But oftentimes walking in with what it could be, but not exactly how it has to be, is the right way to start those conversations. That's true whether you're an entrepreneur pitching investors. That's true whether you're inside a company trying to get colleagues interested. Sharing what it could be, not how it has to be, is the clearest way to flip outsiders into insiders. So that's number 1. Number 2 is to cast a central character. Cast a central character. So one of the things that I have found about entrepreneurs is that they really tend to think in stories. They think in stories, but they also think in substance. And that's the magic of a great storyteller, is somebody who can combine stories with substance. Stories bring us in, but substance actually really keeps us there. And the way that they do that effectively is they bring to mind one person, just one person that they're trying to serve. Even if it's millions of people, they bring to mind one person that they're trying to serve, one very clear person. The person who first brought this to my attention was Tim Ferriss. And Tim Ferriss is the author of a few books. He has a big podcast. And what Tim Ferriss told me is that when he was writing a book called The 4-Hour Workweek, he actually pitched the idea to a bunch of different publishers, and 16 publishers in a row said, no, we don't want the book. So he was defeated. He was deflated. He went home, and he was about to scrap the whole project when his agent called him and said, listen, Tim, why don't you rewrite this book? But instead of writing it for millions of people, why don't you write it for one friend? Just pick one friend and write it for him or her. And so he does. He literally picks a friend of his from college who was going through a tough time, and he rewrote the book as if he was writing it just for that person. And when he rewrote it in that way, the sharpness of his writing, the clarity of his writing was just so much better than it was before. And all of a sudden, publishers were clamoring for it. They wanted the book. It's a very powerful technique and yet very seldomly talked about because as entrepreneurs, we often want to reach millions of people, right? We want our ideas to have as much impact as possible. And yet, if you look at the most entrepreneurial people, what they always do is they bring one person to mind. When Oprah, in her early days, met a woman named Susie. She talks about this interaction with a woman named Susie, who was a suburban mom. And she met Susie early on in her career, and she thought to herself, gosh, this is the exact type of person that I'm trying to serve. Now, this was, again, early on, but as her audiences started to grow from hundreds to thousands to millions, she continued to keep that one person in mind. Every time she got up on stage, she was thinking about Susie. Every time she had a meeting with her producers backstage, they would talk about, would Susie like this? So the thing that you have to think about as an entrepreneur is, who is your Susie? Who is that one person you're trying to serve? And again, that doesn't mean you don't want to serve millions of people, but picking one person really helps. You know, the company that I started was called Rise. And Rise was a one-on-one nutrition coaching business. So what we did is we matched you with a personal nutritionist right over your mobile phone. And so when I was pitching this idea to investors, I'd walk in with the numbers. I would talk about the rising rates of hypertension and obesity and diabetes, all the things that you might expect in a classic pitch deck. I had all the data. And at the very end of my pitch, I would tell the story of my dad. And the story of my dad is that when he was in his early 40s, he had a triple bypass surgery, emergency. He literally dropped me off at school and said, hey, I've got a routine doctor's appointment. I'll see you back here at 3 o'clock. By the time 3 o'clock rolled around, he was already on the emergency room table. So I go with my mom to pick him up days later from the hospital, and I remember driving home thinking to myself, my dad looks like he's 20 years older than the last time that I saw him. But they had handed us a folder, and I opened up the folder, and inside that folder was a piece of paper that the hospital gave us, and that piece of paper said, how to eat. How to eat. And I look at the piece of paper, and it says things like, eat broccoli, eat Brussels sprouts. And I remember thinking to myself, we're Indian. We don't eat broccoli. We don't eat Brussels sprouts. That's not necessarily part of our diet. You know, my parents both worked, at American companies. We lived kind of an American lifestyle, but Indian food was our way of connecting with our culture. And I knew that that diet that they were preferring for us wasn't going to stick. And it didn't. Within 60 days, my dad was back at the hospital. Only this time, the hospital gave us the help of a private nutritionist, somebody who could really help him customize a diet that would really stick, something that would actually help us be healthy, but at the same time be able to embrace our culture. And it was because of the help of that nutritionist that I believe that my dad is alive today. At the time, doctors were giving him 5, maybe 10 years. It's been over 25 years, and I just talked to him this morning. He walked 3 miles from the help of that one person. Now, my goal with Rise was to take a service like that and to make it accessible for everybody. And I told that story at the very end of my investor presentation. And finally, an investor pulled me aside and said, why are you saving that story to the very end? Why don't you tell that story at the beginning? Bring us in with the story. And then you can talk about the millions of people out there who are going through their own version of your dad's story. It's stories that bring us in, but it's substance that actually keeps us there. And great entrepreneurs understand how to do both. But if you read a great article, you read the New York Times, you read the Wall Street Journal, oftentimes what you'll find is they'll start out with one person's story because they know that's what pulls us in. Now, once you've actually established your Susie, right, you have an idea and you know exactly who you're serving, it is really, really important to always keep that person front in mind. Somebody who can always be accessible. In fact, one of the things that I found about entrepreneurial people is that they'll do what I call the spotlight switch. The spotlight switch. And it's one of the easiest techniques that I could share with you tonight. It's something you can put into practice immediately. And here's what it is. Every time you're starting to feel stressed out, every time you're starting to feel like the pressure is on you, all you need to do is inside your mind, think to yourself, who is that one person I'm trying to serve right now? Even with what you do, even if you don't have a business right now, even if you're going to school, you're getting an education, there's always somebody in our lives. There's always somebody in our lives that we are trying to serve. There always is somebody that we're doing it for that's beside ourselves. And when you're in those moments, when you feel like the spotlight is burning bright on you and the pressure is getting overwhelming, take the spotlight and switch it to that person inside your head. Literally. Just make a little click, click noise in your head and imagine that spotlight shifting from you to them. And I have seen people who are terrified of public speaking use the spotlight switch, and all of a sudden, things are better. One of my favorite stories of that is Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was terrified, horrified of public speaking, hated it. He was an attorney, a young attorney, and during his first court case, he was in the courtroom, he's representing his client. He was so nervous that he literally sweat through his clothes. And right in the middle of the case, he ran out of the room. He was so horrified what was going on. So how does somebody like that go from being terrified to being a revolutionary public speaker, being a revolutionary entrepreneurial being? Because he used the spotlight switch. Every single time he get up on stage, every time he get up in front of an audience, he would think to himself, who is this for? Because I know that person is not just me. Who am I doing this for? And then switch the spotlight to them. So we talked about flip outsiders to insiders. Then we talked about cast a central character. The third thing is don't just manage your time, but manage your energy. Don't just manage your time, manage your energy. You know, years ago, after I started my company, Rise, an entrepreneur came in to see me, and he was starting another business in the health space, and he explained the idea to me, and he said, I'm building a meditation app. I want more people to meditate. And at the time, I had just gotten into meditation, and I was into the idea of meditation, but I really didn't think that there was going to be a lot of people out there who were going to download this app. I was like, I'll be an advisor, and I ended up being one of his first investors. But I remember going home to my wife and telling her, look, I just don't think that this is going to work. Well, the name of that service was Calm. And today, there are over 4 million people that use Calm on a daily basis. 4 million people that are meditating. And by the way, these are not Buddhist monks. These are CEOs, these are athletes, these are senior executives that take time out of their day in order to meditate. LeBron James, Shawn Mendes, Camila Cabello, they're all involved in the company now. These are extremely busy people, extremely busy. But they take their time out of their day in order to use the app and to have that quiet time. So the question that I think all of us should ask is, why? Why are they doing that? Well, look, I think to be the best version of ourselves, we have sort of been told that it's all about grit and hustle, right? Grit it out, hustle hard, and success will follow. And to a certain degree, that is true. And yet, if you look at the qualities of grit, relentlessness, being always on, doing whatever it takes to win, these are also some of the same exact qualities that are scientifically associated with burnout. And so if all you're doing is gritting it out and all you're doing is hustling, you are eventually going to be on a path where you cannot be the best version of yourself. And so what people who are high performers, people who are extraordinary are starting to learn is that there are two sides to this coin. There's, of course, grit and hustle, but then there's this idea of replenishment. Because in order to be the best that we can be, we need to do what I call flying loose, which means that we can be in chaotic situations, but we can keep our sense of calm. So I want you to try a little exercise with me. I want you to reach your hands out in front of you, just like this, okay? And I want you to sort of just imagine that you're holding a beach ball softly. So your fingers are curved just a little bit, and there's distance between each finger, okay? And just imagine that what you're holding right now are your dreams, are your goals, are your ambitions, what you really want out of life, okay? And I want you to just close your eyes for a moment and imagine that. And then I want you to tune in to your fingertips. I want you to feel the sensation right now in your fingertips. And you're probably feeling a tingling sensation. And that tingling sensation that you're feeling, that's called qi. The Taoists call it qi. The Hindus call it prana. In the West here, we call it life force. That's your energy. That's your deep energy. But now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to close each finger so that all your fingers are tight and straight, so there's no distance between each finger. So just straight hands, almost like it's straight out. You can look at me if you need to for a moment. Okay, so your hands are straight like this, straight out. And now tune back into your fingertips. What happened? The energy cut off. You're not feeling that tingling sensation anymore. Go ahead, put your hands down. We have been told that it is a combination of hustle and grit, and that's all it takes to be successful, right? But the problem with that is that if you go like this for too long, you cut off the energy supply that it takes to be the best version of you that you need to be. And so counterintuitively, non-obviously sometimes, we need to fly loose. If you talk to fighter pilots and you ask them, how do you deal with turbulent situations? What they will tell you is that the more turbulent it gets, the more dangerous it gets, the softer their hands need to be, the more relaxed they have to be in order to rise into those situations. But oftentimes we're taught that in order to rise to a certain situation, we have to clench our fists. We need to hustle harder. We need to grit it out. And when we do that, we miss the ability to fly loose. And if you look at top performers, you look at peak performers, they have learned the ability to fly loose. In fact, if you look at most peak performers, the studies will show that they're taking anywhere between 7 and 8 breaks a day. 7 and 8 breaks a day. I call this rhythmic recovery. Rhythmic recovery. Because think about it, when we often think about sort of our way of replenishing ourselves, our way of recovering, what do we think about? We think about vacations, right? Or maybe taking a weekend. But by the time we get to those places, by the time Friday rolls around, or by the time we take a vacation, we might already be in the red. Our our hands might be like this, clenched. And then when you're like this, it's very hard to unclench. It's very hard to find that looseness, that loose grip, light grip again. And so what extraordinary performers, extraordinary entrepreneurs tend to do is they tend to take breaks every single day. We just don't see them, right? So we kind of assume that people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are working around the clock. And to a certain degree they are, but they are also rhythmically putting rest periods in between. And again, between 7 and 8 rest periods a day is what the science tells us gets us into our optimal state. And one of the ways that I like to bring that into my life is through what I call the 55-5 model. The 55-5 model, which is that for every 55 minutes of work, I'm building in 5 minutes of rest. And it literally can be anything. You know, sometimes I meditate, sometimes I take a walk, sometimes I play with my pet. You can really do anything. And what I'd love for you to do today, sometime soon, is pull out an index card or pull out something that you can write down all the things within 5 minutes or less that you can do that can actually bring your energy up a little bit and lighten that clench, right? And create your list. Some people like to listen to music. And then at any point in time, be able to pull out that list. It could even be on your phone. Pull out that list and be able to refer back to it. Because there are always these moments where we're starting to get triggered. There are always these moments where we're starting to feel the pressure. We don't have to wait until we get into the red. You can build these rhythmic recoveries in between. I've got to tell you this story. I'm shooting a television show now in Los Angeles, and I was out there for about a month. And I get picked up one morning, and the driver, I could just tell, you could just tell he was in a bad mood. It was early in the morning. I think he fought a lot of LA traffic, and I could just tell he was in a bad place. Big guy, really big guy. And we drive to the set. I'm sitting in the back seat, and we pull onto the studio lot. And I go out on a limb, and I say to him, "Hey, I'm going to meditate. Would you like to meditate with me?" And he looks at me in the rearview mirror, stares at me, and I think to myself, oh boy, this guy's going to kick my ass. But instead, he says, "Sure, I'll meditate with you." So I pull out the Calm app, and I put a 5-minute meditation on, and the two of us just sit there in the car, in the studio lot, and we meditate together inside this automobile. And when the 5 minutes is up, I get out of the car, but so does he. He literally comes around the car, and by the time I get out the door, he's waiting there. Big bear hug. Literally wraps his arms around me. This guy's twice my size. Wraps his arms around me, pulls me in tight, and he says, "Thank you. I needed that. I needed that." And then he reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out this emblem, this thing that he carries around with him for good luck. And he says, "I want you to have this. I want you to have this." And now I carry this with me everywhere. I carry it with me every time I give a talk, every time I'm on set, because I think it brings me good luck. But just think about that for a moment. It was a 5-minute meditation. It's a 5-minute break in his day. That's the power of just taking a time out. And imagine if you were to build that into your schedule. If you were to take 7 to 8 of those. When I work with my clients, when I work with executives and athletes with this, and I give them this formula, what they tell me is that for the first time in their lives that they can remember, they're ending the day with more energy than they began it with. When's the last time you could say that was true? Because all we're doing is depleting ourselves throughout the day, but if you rebuild as you're depleting, you are finding the way to peak performance. So don't just manage your time, but manage your energy. The last thing I want to say is that long-term success comes from short-term embarrassment. Let me say that again. Long-term success comes from short-term embarrassment. In the product development world, we have a saying that you may have heard before, which is that if you are not embarrassed by the first version of your product, well, then you've launched too late. So if you're going to embarrass yourself, though, you can start with a close circle of people. I was talking to Anthony earlier on from the entrepreneurship department. He was telling me about how, RIT, where you are here, this is a great place to fail. And I thought that was a brilliant statement. How lucky to be part of a community where you can actually fail, because it's such an important thing to have, a circle of people around you. And you are part of a small, I think, tight-knit community where that is possible, and that is a total gift. In 2004, one of my first jobs ever, and this is out of undergrad, was working as a writer. And I was working as a writer backstage at the Democratic National Convention in Boston. And there were a lot of speakers backstage, and I kind of knew who most people were, and I was helping them get their speeches in order for the stage. But there was one guy I did not recognize. And so I go to the stage manager and I say, "Hey, who is that?" Because he was speaking later on that night. And the guy backstage says, "He is a state senator from Illinois. His name is Barack Obama." And I got to watch that night as Barack Obama got up on stage and gave the big speech that put him on the map. And while it seemed like the whole world was watching Senator Obama at that time, I was watching him from backstage, and I just watched electricity just rip through the crowd in an unbelievable way. Even just talking about it, it sends chills down my spine. But I remember after that moment thinking to myself, I've got to learn everything I know. I've got to learn everything I can about this guy. And so I literally flew to Chicago, and I started talking to people who were working closely at that time with Barack Obama. And what I found out really, really surprised me. It turns out that Barack Obama had run for Congress in the year 2000. Just 4 years before that speech, he had run for Congress, and he lost. And he lost big, by a 2-to-1 margin. It wasn't close. But what was even more surprising than that was the way that Obama was received. People saw him as stilted. They saw him as professorial. They saw him as somebody who really did not know how to inspire a room. So how did he go from that to what we saw 4 years later, and eventually what we saw in the presidency? Well, he did it through having a circle of people. He did it through finding the right mentors who could give him the right feedback. And one of those mentors was Jesse Jackson. And Jesse Jackson would bring Barack Obama to a place called the Rainbow Push Coalition, where every Sunday, Obama would give his speech. He'd give some version of a stump speech, and he would get feedback from the audience, and he'd get feedback from the people around him. He had a place where he could fail. And by having a place that he could fail, he was able to win. He was able to succeed. And for the first time ever, what he says is that he saw failure not as the opposite of success, but failure as a pathway to success. Being in a place where you can fail and finding people around you who can help you do that. So we are coming up on time here. I'm gonna open it up for Q&A, but I want to really quickly tell you that we are in a place where you have a community around you. And what I found when I study extraordinary people is they tend to have a community around them too. In fact, what I found is that most entrepreneurial people tend to surround themselves with 4 different types of people. 4 different types of people. And I call these the 4 C's. And the first C is your collaborator. Your collaborator. And this is somebody, when you're with them, you kind of feel like you're in a musical jam session together. They're using language like yes and. They're helping you build on top of your ideas. The second is your coach. Your coach. And your coach is different than your collaborator, because if your collaborator is really focused on whether your idea is good for the market or good for the company you're working in, your coach is really thinking about, is this idea good for you? Is this an idea that actually fits you? You know, when Martin Luther King was stepping into his role in the leadership movement for the civil rights movement, he was very young. He was only 24 years old. In fact, when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, he was only 26. It's unbelievable. But one of the stories that he tells is about how he went to go see his mentor when he was trying to figure out whether to step into this leadership role. He went to go see his coach. And what he said to this guy, Howard Thurman, is, I think the world really needs this right now. And Howard Thurman looks at Martin Luther King and he says, don't just ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs right now is more people who have come alive. And so your coach is somebody who is going to be honest with you. They know you intimately well enough to know, does this idea actually make you come alive? The third C is your cheerleader. Your cheerleader. And we all need a cheerleader in our lives. I know it sounds a little sappy, but we all need somebody we can call and know that no matter what, they're going to give us that juice that we need before we walk into a room. And the fourth C, I think, is the least appreciated, but probably the most important. And I call this person your cheddar. Your cheddar. And the reason I call this person your cheddar is because if you've ever seen the movie 8 Mile, Eminem is surrounded by a circle of friends, and they're all kind of building him up. But there's one friend named Cheddar who's constantly poking holes in his ideas. Cheddar is your critic. And what we find throughout the film is that Eminem gets ready for the stage not because of the friends who are building him up, but because of Cheddar that was poking holes in his ideas. And we all have that Cheddar in our lives, right? And that person can be kind of annoying sometimes. But it's really Cheddar that's going to get us ready for these big entrepreneurial moments. I want to say one last thing, which is that years ago, I had a chance to visit the kingdom of Bhutan. And Bhutan is a really interesting country because they measure progress in Bhutan based on what they call gross national happiness. Gross national happiness. So GDP and economic growth are very important, but what matters even more than that is how it feeds into this overall idea of happiness. And it's not perfect, but they've done some extraordinary things over there. So when I was on the ground, I had a chance to spend time with this research team that has been collecting all this information for the past 50 years. And I asked them, is there one question one question that you can ask someone to get a pretty good indicator of whether they're happy or not? And they said, yeah, as a matter of fact, there is. And the question is, if you were in real trouble right now, who could you call and know with 100% certainty they would be there for you? They believe people who have an answer to that question have a much higher likelihood of being happy. But there's a big twist. And the twist is, whose list are you on? Who can call you and know with 100% certainty you would be there for them? And they believe that people who can answer that question have an even higher likelihood of being happy. So one thing I would like you to consider doing is at some point tonight, just write down the names of a few people who you don't see every day. But if they called you, there is no doubt in your mind that you would be there for them. You jump in a car, you jump on a plane, you do whatever it took to be there for them. And then ask yourself one question for each of those names. Do they know that? Do they know that they could call you and you would be there for them? And if the answer to that is no, or if the answer to that is maybe, then give them a call. Especially now, give them a call and let them know that you are on their list. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Is the microphone on?
I could be loud enough. That would be okay. All right. So first of all, Suneel, thank you so much. That was awesome. I obviously we didn't know what you were going to talk about. That's why we showed up, right? But you used the first C was collaborator. And the one thing that really hit me throughout the talk was this idea of collaboration, people, getting people from the outside, inside. The 4 C's that you talked about at the end,
Yeah.
What's your best advice for putting together that council? How do you do that?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think number one is that it could be that one person plays multiple roles, but it doesn't have to be. And I think a couple things that are important is that once you find people who are really good in any of those roles, hang on to them. And so one of the things I find, even when I study people like Elon Musk, they're hanging out with their circle that they have known for years and years, even though these people don't work at Tesla, they don't work at SpaceX. And so once you find people who are in your circle, it's up to you to do a good job keeping in touch with them, right? And you want to make sure you hang on to that council. That's one thing. The second thing is that even if you have one person who is playing multiple roles, you want to be very clear with them on what you're looking for. So for example, if you're about to walk into a big moment, right, a big pitch, a big presentation, you don't need cheddar at that point in time, right? You definitely don't need cheddar. What you need is a cheerleader, right, and maybe a coach, but you definitely don't need cheddar. But so you want to be very clear with people about what you're looking for. So on the other hand, early on the stage in your idea, you can walk into a room with somebody and say, hey, right now I'm looking for a collaborator. I'm really looking for you to help me build on top of my idea. But too often we walk in and we talk to people, we don't tell them what we're looking for from them. And so if we don't tell people what we're looking for from them, they're going to kind of give us whatever they think they want to give us. Right? So just being very clear with people, and then to your point, once you find people, hang on to them. Great question.
I love the idea of fail-con. Oh, sorry. I love the idea of fail-con because it implies that there's at least a significant number of people who get the value of failure, who understand. Oh, you're not getting it? Are you hearing me? Okay, cool. As educators here at the university, I think teaching the value of failure and teaching a certain degree of comfort with failure, that failing because of not putting forward an effort is something I would discourage, but failure because of putting forward an effort is something I would love all my students to embrace. Do you have any thoughts about how one can engender or promote that type of mentality?
Possibly get this? Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, I think what you're talking about is, I think, everything that I didn't want to learn, right? So for me, I wanted to be seen as successful. I wanted people to view me as a success. And so even though this, today I can joke about being New York Times poster child for failure, it was actually a pretty painful moment for me, because I knew that every time somebody Googled me from now on, that was going to be one of the first articles that came up, right? And so reputationally, I didn't want that. But what I will say is that we need more people talking about their failures. This is a wonderful community, because even when I talk to, I'm clearly not your first speaker who has come in front of you and talked to you about entrepreneurship. You've had many, many great speakers. One of the things that I would encourage is every time somebody visits the classroom, every time somebody comes up on stage here, to ask them about what went wrong, right? Because those are the things that don't make the bio, and those are the things that don't make the LinkedIn profile. But by asking them about those setbacks, you start to realize that it was really the setbacks that informed the success. You start to realize that in a lot of ways, success is a very lousy teacher. It's really failure that sort of makes us who we are. And so I think of getting more people out there talking about that, because it's everywhere. I will tell you that is a common denominator. I have not yet met a successful entrepreneur who has not had failure in their past. It's just a question of how do we get those stories out in the open. But in the meantime, I think that that's something we can all sort of just know, like trust me, in that I have spent nothing but spending time with entrepreneurs over the past 8 years, studying everything about their backgrounds and rewinding the clock, and every single one of them had failed.
I wanted to ask, what could you say has been one of your greatest failures, and the lesson that you were able to learn from that failure that stuck with you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I talked before about the companies that I had started that failed, but I actually want to tell you about another one, which is that a couple of years ago, I decided to move back to my hometown in Michigan. I was living in San Francisco, and after the 2016 election, I decided that I wanted to move back to Michigan, and I wanted to run for office. I wanted to be part of what was happening on the scene, what was really happening in our country at that time. And I put myself out there, and I lost. I lost that election. And when you run for office and you lose, it's pretty public. It's a very public way to fail, right? Everybody around you knows. All of your neighbors know. I drop my kids off at school. Their teachers know. Everybody knows. But I guess the thing that I learned that I hadn't learned before is that there were times when I was running for office. There were times when I was up on stage like this, where I really didn't feel like I was being very myself. I wasn't being who I really was. I was sort of saying things that I felt like other people wanted to hear, and I think politics has a way of doing that sometimes. You're sort of playing to the audience. And I remember thinking to myself, it's one thing to lose being who you are, but it's a whole different thing to lose being who you're not. And if I had to go back and do it all over again, I would say to myself, no matter what, you've got to be who you are. That is the most important thing. It is better to fail. For me, I grew up going to temple, and we learned this thing called dharma. And the literal translation of dharma is calling, what you're calling in life. And it's really who you are, right? What you're being. And the lesson, the thing that I keep telling myself over and over again, especially now after that failure, is that it is better to fail at your own dharma than it is to succeed at someone else's. Yeah.
On? Yes. Earlier you mentioned working for, like, moving and making something for one person and helping it succeed. However, I've seen many times that people see this success and get a rush, and then they lose sight of this.
Yeah.
They had that original vision, and then
Yeah.
it's gone. They just run out and like, where did it go?
Yeah, yeah. It's a great point. In fact, I mentioned Groupon earlier on, and I'll tell you the story. So the first time that I ever met Andrew Mason, who was the founder and CEO of Groupon, what happened was I flew to Chicago, where the company was based, and I was expecting us to sit inside a conference room and do an interview, and instead he says, let's go take a walk. So literally we walk around the streets of Chicago, and as we're walking around the streets of Chicago, he's literally pointing to different vendors, different small businesses, and he's saying, Jack runs that place. He loves to bake. He started baking when he was a kid with his grandma, and now he has a bakery. That person over there loves to sew. That's what they do. That's their craft. Then he knew the stories of all these different small businesses. And it was that level of intimacy over our central character, who was the small business owner, that really for me was like, I need to come work here. I need to do this. But to your point, an excellent one, as we got bigger, as we started to focus on the numbers, we started to lose sight of that central character, because now we're focused more on revenue, we're focused more on profit. All of a sudden, the meetings inside Groupon went from talking about our central character, the small business owner, to just talking about what the spreadsheets look like. And just imagine that for the people on the team. When you're getting out of bed in the morning, do you want to get out of bed thinking about spreadsheets, or do you want to get out of bed thinking about how you're serving somebody else? And it's not to say that the numbers don't matter, they absolutely do, but you can have both, and you can have a central character be front and center. Now, compare that for a second to the story of Airbnb. With Airbnb, I went to their very first office. It was in Potrero Hill, and I met with Brian Chesky, the founder CEO at that time. This is, 10 years ago. And what was crazy is that up on their wall, they had what they call a storyboard, which was literally a play-by-play. It was a drawn-out sequence by sequence of what their guest goes through, from getting the keys to enjoying the apartment or the place to exploring the city. They had a play-by-play of everything that happened. They did the same thing for the host. And so now engineers, designers, business people, marketers, they would all gather around these storyboards. And they would look at it and they would say, hey, what about that part of the experience? Maybe we could change that a little bit. And the finance person would say, yeah, if we change that part of the experience, we might be able to generate more revenue. And the marketing person would say, yeah, if we did that, we could actually build a campaign around it. So now they're collaborating around the story, right? They're collaborating around the story. What was crazy, though, is that storyboard, Airbnb has changed office maybe 4 or 5 times since then because they continue to get so big. So the office always looks very different each time, but the one thing that they have taken to every single office is that storyboard because they want to keep it front and center. So I believe that companies that lose sight of that central character do not do well. And those that keep that central character front and center are the ones that are going to flourish. Thanks. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. I think we can do, yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us.
Sure.
What happened in your life that made you realize, okay, now I'm actually going to write a book, which actually turned out to be hugely successful? So you went from sort of a different story into, you changed paths in a dramatic way, and now you're very successful in a lot of ways. What was that within you that made you realize I need to write and share in that way?
Yeah. For me, I think writing has been therapy more than anything else. Someone gave me advice a long time ago that I should sit down and just write in the mornings. Just write your thoughts out. And it doesn't, and the reason that I resisted that initially was I thought to myself, well, who am I writing for? Well, why would I write if I don't have an audience? And then I started to realize that for me, writing was therapy. Taking these thoughts that was inside my head, and that may never be read. But it was inside my head. I felt like it was inside my soul, and I needed to get it down on paper. And the way that this book, Backable, was written is it's about 150 or so pages, but I wrote probably about 1,000 pages. I had about 1,000 pages that I ended up taking to my publisher, and they were like, well, obviously this is way too long. We're not writing the Bible, right? And so we had to take that 1,000 pages, and we had to cull it down, and we cut a lot of stuff. But one of the best pieces of advice that I got, it's funny, one of the authors that I admire a lot is a guy named Salman Rushdie. And Salman Rushdie, when I was in business school, he was passing through town. I was going to school in Chicago. And I begged him to meet me for coffee. I emailed him like 5 times. And finally he emailed me back and said, stop emailing me. I will meet you at this place. I'm going there for dinner. If you show up at this time, I'll show up a few minutes early and we can talk. And so I get there, and I've got my list of questions. I'm really eager. And the first question I ask him is, how do you get inspired to write? And you could just tell immediately, as soon as those words left my mouth, it was the worst question that I could have asked him. Because he stares at me for a moment, and he says, I don't get inspired to write. I just write. And the vast majority of what I write every day ends up in the trash bin. But I sit down at my desk just like anybody else with a cup of coffee, and I just write all day. And every day, even though the majority of it goes to waste, there's a little pearl that I'll find, usually a little pearl. And what I do as a writer is I string together those pearls into sentences and eventually to paragraphs and eventually to real books. And that's how he's written 13 books. And so I found that to be kind of an inspiring way to go about it. Yeah. So I know we're about to wrap here. I just want to share sort of just one last thing, which is that I have always believed that courage leads to action. Courage leads to action. But I was wrong. I was wrong about that. Courage does not lead to action. Action leads to courage. And if you look at the most entrepreneurial people, they play what I call the game of now, where they act and then they let courage catch up along the way. And one of my favorite examples of this is a woman named Damayanti Hingorani. Incredible story. She was written up in Time magazine just a couple years ago. And what makes her story amazing is that she grew up as a refugee in a refugee camp with no running water, no electricity. But she discovered a book, and she taught herself how to read it. And that book was the biography of Henry Ford. She read it cover to cover and had this really unlikely dream. And the dream was, one day I want to move to America, and I want to be an engineer with Ford Motor Company. And her parents get behind the dream. They save every penny they have to get her on a boat where she gets to the United States. She gets a scholarship to Oklahoma State University. And the day after she graduates, she literally drives to Detroit, Michigan to apply for her dream job, and she finds her way into a room with a hiring manager. But when this hiring manager gets into a room, he looks at her resume, he looks at her application, and he says, wait a second, are you applying for the job of an engineer? And she says, yeah. And he says, well, I'm sorry. We don't have any female engineers working here right now. Because see, this was the 1960s. And while Ford Motor Company was in its heyday, doing very well, thousands of engineers on staff, not a single one of them was a woman. So Damayanti Hingorani is deflated in this moment, and she picks up her resume, she picks up her purse, and she begins to walk out of the room. And then almost in this last-ditch moment, she turns around, she looks this hiring manager in the eyes, and she tells him her story about all the struggle that it took for her to get to this country, to get to this city, to get to this very room. And then she says to him, look, if you don't have any female engineers on staff, things are changing. Do yourself a favor and hire me now. And it was in this moment that this hiring manager is so moved by her story that he goes out and he fights with his colleagues. He fights with his bosses. He fights with everybody around him. And in 1967, Damayanti Hingorani becomes Ford Motor Company's first female engineer. And I love that story because it moved so many people. It inspired immigrants who were hoping for a better day. It inspired other women in the workforce.
And it inspired me because Damayanti Hingorani is my mom. And thank you. Thank you. If a middle manager from suburban Michigan had not taken a chance on a refugee from the other side of the world, well, then I wouldn't be here right now to help tell her story. So as we go out into the world as entrepreneurs, let's bring ourselves into the place, let's bring ourselves into the world, but let's also help good people. Let's find good people and help them bring their ideas into the world. Because sometimes the biggest difference that we can make is by helping other people make theirs. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Suneel, for those inspiring words and for being here today with us.